Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the next in our Faithful Thinking series. We're joined by a new guest today, Dr. Jonathan Rogers. Jonathan, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you, Simon.
Would you like to tell us a little bit who you are, where you're calling in from?
Yeah, so I'm Jonathan. I work as a psychiatrist in the NHS, and I mainly work in South London, where I see some patients and do some research.
Thank you. And besides being a psychiatrist, you're also obviously a Christian. Could you just tell us, why are you a Christian?
Yeah, certainly. So I was brought up in a Christian home, but and I think I always believed in God, but it wasn't really till I was about 10 or 11 that I realized that actually it wasn't about what I needed to do to be saved. It was about what God had done for me. And I think that was the big shift in mindset for me. And then I'm glad to say that the journey hasn't stopped there. God's continued to change me, to hopefully refine me and teach me lots more.
Great, thank you. Well, we're very glad to have you with us. As a Christian of faith and also as a doctor and a psychiatrist, how do you find those two work together? Are they in conflict? Is there a tension? Or are they a productive synergy?
Yeah, actually, I think that there are a lot fewer issues than people think. And I think that they actually go very well together. As a psychiatrist, I work with people with severe mental illnesses who are very vulnerable, often rejected by society. And I think that goes very well with the gospel call to seek the least, the lost, the last. And when I look at Jesus' life, that the people he spent time with, it's very helpful when I'm about to see a patient and I think and I'm running out of compassion sometimes. And it's interesting. Before I qualified as a doctor, I thought that the main issues between my faith and my work would be classic ethical issues, things like abortion, euthanasia. But actually, it's been the more mundane sins in the Bible that we read about. So I'm constantly challenged to be honest and not exaggerate things. I'm challenged to be kind to colleagues, even when they haven't been that helpful to me. So actually, I think there's a lot more in common with what other people struggle with than unique challenges.
Thank you. I mean, sometimes there's the idea going around, I think, that modern science, and especially perhaps in this context, psychology, can explain away or can explain why some people believe that it's a product of a particular brain structure, and that if you really understand how the world works and how people works, it removes any need for faith. I'm presuming that's not been your experience. How do you feel about that?
No, I think psychology can be helpful in understanding how we think and how other people think. And in a few rare occasions, it's enabled us to learn how to think better. But it's a science in its infancy. And I think the main point, though, is that there are different levels of understanding things. So if a person drinks a lot of alcohol one evening and they have a hangover the following morning, you could explain that in terms of the effects on ethanol in dehydrating your body and your cells and giving you those physical symptoms. But I don't think it's unreasonable to also say that maybe that's one way in which God shows people that getting really drunk isn't a very good idea. I don't think those are mutually contradictory at all. And I think probably we can think about the mind in the same way. So we can understand it on a biological level. You've got the nerve cells, the neurons with electrical impulses going through, getting to a synapse, releasing these chemicals. You can understand it on a psychological level. So you can understand the way in which people might get trapped in a particular pattern of thinking, for example. And you can also understand what the mind's doing in terms of a social level. So is this a reaction to a change in your role, a bereavement? But I think none of those is incompatible with understanding what your mind does on a spiritual level. So is this because, am I doing this because I'm very self-centered? Is this part of my rebellion against God? Is this a way in which God is teaching me something, for instance? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, that's helpful. I guess just to push this thread of conversation a little further, I remember having a teacher when I was at school who related how she had been very religious until she was in a car crash and sustained a head injury, and thereafter became an atheist, and very confidently told her class that this was one of the things that demonstrated that faith was just about the physical structure of your brain, and if certain parts of the brain developed one way, you would have faith, and if they developed another way, you wouldn't. So in her perspective, faith was purely the product of brain chemistry. And she argued that there was no objective component to it. There was no real God out there. It was just that some people experienced faith feelings and some didn't. And I've occasionally encountered that school of skepticism that says that actually religion is just a set of feelings that some people have because their brains have developed one way. Other people don't have it because their brains didn't develop that way, but it's purely the product of subjective mental makeup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a couple of points on that. Firstly, with all respect to your primary school teacher, I don't really
secondary,
buy...
actually, but...
Secondary, okay, even more significant. Okay, I don't really buy the example because having a car crash is also a big psychological event. And actually, if being religious were just down to anatomy, the way your brain was set up, you'd expect people to stay the same throughout life. And actually, we all know that people are sometimes converted and come to faith late in life. I think that the bigger issue with this thinking, though, is that if we think that if we think that just because the way your brain operates affects the way you think, and that means that there's nothing objective, I think we can think of a lot of counterexamples to that. There are some people who, maybe because of their brain, maybe because of their upbringing or the people they've met, believe that the world is flat. Most people, our brains are set up to think that the world is round. Now, just because our brains, our psychology, our environment has made us this way, it doesn't mean that there isn't an objective reality. One of those is true. I don't know what your view is, but my view is that the world is round. So I think just because different people's brains are maybe set up to believe different things, I think it doesn't mean that there's not something real out there.
Yes, I think one of the dangers with that line of thinking is that it's a bit of an Ouroboros. It consumes itself, in that if you end up saying that everything we think and feel is the product of brain chemistry, then all human thinking and feeling and belief becomes meaningless, whether that's the belief that 2 + 2 = 4, or the belief that Newtonian mechanics holds true when you're building a spaceship. There's something terribly reductionist about it if it says that it's purely a product of brain chemistry and therefore can't be objectively trusted. Historically speaking, one of the great steps forward in the development of science in the West, at least, was that the Christian faith taught that human thought was derived from the maker of the universe, and therefore you could know objectively what the world was like based on your thoughts. And this, I imagine it might be pop psychology rather than true psychology, that seeks to dismiss beliefs and ideas and theories by claiming that the brain is just wired that way is in danger of undoing that, I would think. And of course, in so doing, it undoes itself, because it's based on on claims about medical knowledge of the brain that are themselves the product of human thinking. So it's self-destructive in the end.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, that the point you make about how some degree of trust, at least in our senses, has been responsible for scientific advance.
Somebody once expressed it to me as skeptical trust is the foundation of science. And I quite like that phrase, that you verify what you think and what you observe, you test it, you check it. But you have at some level to believe it, or else you can't move anywhere. You can't get anywhere. And any school of thought that seeks to dismiss human belief or observation, human experience or human thinking as the product of evolution or body chemistry alone, deconstructs that. And actually, I think it's one of the big problems for the very sort of reductionist evolutionary psychology that one comes across, is that it deconstructs its own foundation. I think C.S. Lewis said that before me, so I can't claim it's original. But, usually, if you come up with any good idea, you find C.S. Lewis has had it already. Let me take the conversation a step further then. Many of our listeners will, I hope, have been following through our morning prayers from Mark's Gospel. And one of the things that can be disconcerting to a modern reader is there's repeated encounters with people who are described as demon-possessed or possessed by an evil spirit. And one of the questions that gets asked is this just ignorant pre-modern people observing mental illness and attributing it to a supernatural cause? Are the Bible's depictions of evil spirits, or indeed of the Holy Spirit at work, really just attempts to explain supernaturally what people didn't understand naturally? Issues of mental health or of group hysteria and exhilaration. What do you think?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question, and I'm not 100% sure what the answer is, but I think we can, using the Bible and what we know about medicine, we can give some parameters to the answer. So the New Testament does talk about demon possession, and sometimes that seems to look like what we call a mental illness. On the other hand, I don't think it's necessarily specific to mental illness. So there are people in the New Testament with what was probably epilepsy caused by demons. And in the Old Testament, Job's boils on his skin, Satan is behind them. So I think that Satan is alive and active in the world. But I don't think, conversely, that we can put every mental illness down to demon possession. And I think there are probably biblical examples which support that. So Elijah, after coming down from Mount Carmel, has what looks a bit like a depressive episode. He's utterly hopeless, almost irrationally hopeless. And the way that God deals with that isn't by casting out a demon, it's actually putting him to sleep for a long time. So more practically, where does that leave us with this question? I think we need to pray for people who are mentally unwell. And I think we need to point them to the Lord Jesus, who's going to be ultimately the solution they need. But I think repeatedly we see God in the Bible using natural methods as well. So Paul appeals to legal methods to get out of the predicaments he's in the New Testament in Acts. But there are also supernatural interventions to get him out of prison. So I think similarly with us, we should seek the spiritual remedies to mental illness, but I think we should also seek the other gifts that God has given us in terms of psychiatrists, psychologists, counsellors, and often your GP.
In the Elijah example you cite, of course, God's prophet hits this depression and God sends an angel to visit him, and you expect spiritual fireworks. And what the angel does is make him go to sleep, cook him a meal, make him eat it, and then make him go to sleep again. God's great cure for his prophet's spiritual malaise is food and rest. And it's a reminder that there's a physical dimension, at least in Elijah's case, physical and emotional exhaustion. Yes, I think it's important to remember that natural and supernatural are not mutually exclusive. It's not either or. Just as when somebody is struggling in life, there's probably a spiritual element and a psychological element, and there might well be a physical element, a social element of having lost a job, lost friends, lost a relationship. And those social triggers might make worse spiritually problematic behavior like drinking, which might lead to psychological problems and so on. There's very seldom one thing happening. Usually there's many happening.
You're absolutely right, and that's quite a lot of what I spend my time doing. I'm teasing, is this person depressed because they're anemic and they don't have much hemoglobin in their blood? And if so, how do we treat it? If we raise their iron, is their depression going to get better? If not, how do we help that? How's this affecting their family? And linking all these things together, dealing with that complexity. Yeah.
There is a similar process that we in the church have to go through when someone comes to us saying that they need exercising or need what we might call deliverance ministry, saying that they're under supernatural attack. And the process is usually one of saying, well, does this person have an obvious mental illness? What's their circumstances? Have they gone through psychological trauma? If they're complaining that their house is bizarrely cold, is the heating working? Do they have a carbon monoxide detector in the house? Because there's a lot of other things that can be causing it. And probably 95 times out of 100, when someone comes to you, it's a purely natural, or a group of natural causes, often filtered through somebody who's not very good at processing and understanding this and gives it a supernatural explanation. Maybe 5 times out of 100, I look at somebody and think, actually, I think there's something more going on here than just the material. And that's rare. And in every case I've come across where I've thought there might be a demonic influence, there's been a bunch of natural problems as well. There has been mental health issues. It's nearly always been somebody who is in some sense socially broken, usually unemployed, usually with no healthy relationships, often with alcohol and drug dependencies, very frequently with accompanying mental illness. And I think there's a bit of a sense that if supernatural evil has got a hold on somebody, it will try and break them. And that will be manifest psychologically and physically and socially, not just spiritually.
That's a good point.
If, as we believe, God is the source of life and light and love, and a healthy, ordered life is most truly found in him, if his enemies have taken a hold upon you, you're not going to be a well-functioning individual. So quite often, on the 1 or 2 occasions I've come across this, there's been a sense of almost, have demonic influences caused the destruction of somebody's life, or has it left them open to demonic influences? But there's never just one thing going on. I should say too, it's very easy perhaps in a church context to go straight to the spiritual explanation when somebody is presenting a difficulty. And I think it's fair to say we need to be very slow to do that, because it can cause harm to those who are psychologically vulnerable. And most of the time there isn't a direct spiritual, there isn't a demon involved, put it that way. We need to be very careful before, and rule out other explanations before we conclude that there's something like that involved. And most churches will have an expert whose job is to handle that kind of discernment.
Okay, right.
And who has special training and so forth to try and deal with it. So we need to be slow to expect that that is the cause today. We see perhaps a lot of instances of demonic activity in the New Testament, probably because it was a time of great spiritual conflict, because Jesus was on earth and the powers of evil ramped up their effort to match him. We don't expect to see that same level today. It can happen, but it's very rare, I think. Sorry, I was meant to be asking you a question and I've been talking.
Yeah, I wonder if also that the sample of human activity in the New Testament isn't very representative. That the Bible doesn't spend a great deal of time talking about people getting out of bed in the morning, because it's not very remarkable. If you're writing a gospel and you had just a few thousand words to do it, you'd stick to the really extraordinary episodes, wouldn't you?
Yes, I think that's really important. The Bible, the New Testament certainly tends to record the extraordinary, not the ordinary. We get more of a picture of the ordinary in the epistles because they're written to churches to regulate their everyday life. And it's perhaps the same as how, if you read the Old Testament, the bits everybody remembers is the parting of the Red Sea and the provision of manna. But the vast majority of the Old Testament narrative was conducted in a much more normal fashion. And if you read books like Proverbs that are meant to give guidance for everyday life, they don't tell you how to get God to part oceans and provide bread in the wilderness. They tell you if you want bread, get a job and work hard. And we need to be careful not to assume that the extraordinary bits of scripture are the rule for our lives, or we will become either disappointed or delusional. Let me take the conversation on a step. We've talked a little bit about issues of mental health and so forth, and I know you've written on the subject as well recently for mental health in COVID-19. Churches, like any other community, I hope, want to be places that are helpful and welcoming and healing, and many people in churches will be struggling with mental health. Probably all of us at some level will have some kind of imperfect mental health. Is there any advice you would give to churches about how we can be helpful, healthy places for people who are working through mental health issues?
Yeah, I think it's a big issue. As you say, I think churches are by and large quite aware of it now. I think that the first thing to say is that often when I see my patients, I think what would do them more good than anything I could do would be for them to actually have a friend. And I think we've talked before about how friendship is probably one of the most underrated virtues in today's society. So friendship's very important. Don't be put off. You don't need any special knowledge to be a friend of someone with a mental health problem. And I think if you do have someone who is, if you know someone who's very severely unwell and is admitted to a psychiatric hospital, do visit them. I've worked in a number of psychiatric hospitals, and often we don't get many visitors. I think because people are scared. They're not too scary places. In terms of how you might help someone one-to-one, it's important to be kind, compassionate, give them time. I think sometimes it's helpful to offer a bit of challenge. So a cycle that people often get into with depression is that people, part of depression is not having motivation and not having much interest in doing activities. And so people don't go out, they don't see their friends, they don't do the hobbies that actually used to make them happy. And so that makes them go even lower. So just a bit of gentle encouragement sometimes to get people to leave the house, to see people. And we talked about basics earlier, so sleep, eating, a good diet. Exercise is really important as well.
Mm.
And that will mean different levels for different people.
Church calisthenics it is then, before the Sunday service. Yes, there's the old saying, isn't there? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think one of the most helpful things we can do as churches is just make sure we are a place where people have lots of good relationships. Jonathan will know far more about this than I, but a number of studies I've read on health suggested that the best predictor of someone's long-term mental and physical health was how many good friendships they had, at least 5 to 10. And I'd love our churches to be a place where we have good, lasting, deep friendships, not where we turn up in our families on a Sunday morning, have the service, exchange meaningless chit-chat over the tea and coffee, and then go away again in our families. Not a place where families meet, but a family. And if you're part of St. Mark's congregation, that's why we have the lunches and the community cafe and so forth, as well as small groups, home groups, prayer triplets, is at least partly to try and encourage us all to be building good friendships and relationships there.
And try to make all of those connections count. So Jesus had different levels of friendships. He had the 1, he had John, he had the 3 disciples he was closest to, the 12, and you could go beyond that. Not everyone in church is going to be our best friend, but those relationships we do have, even if we chat to someone every month or so after church, we can make that meaningful, as you say, rather than idle chit-chat. It can be deeper. It can be about application of the sermon. It can be about your spiritual well-being. It can be about how you're actually feeling.
I think something practical I would say is often you need to be willing to be a little bit vulnerable or a little bit open yourself to build a relationship with someone else. I was going to say there's nothing worse. There are many things worse, but a bad thing is the Christian who is determined to look after everyone else and so grills them passionately about how they're doing at every possible occasion. And it's never a two-way street, it's always one way. They're not willing to receive, only to give. And actually, all of us need to receive as well as to give. The church isn't divided into healthy Christians and needy Christians, givers and receivers. We all need each other. We all need to be willing to receive from others and to give to others. And sometimes being willing to open up about when you're stressed and down and frustrated or struggling with something you've read or heard is the best way to build a relationship, because the vulnerability means that you're not a threat. Sometimes I think, especially with the mental health issue, we have a mindset that divides the world into those who are mentally healthy, who are therefore fine and don't need anything, and those who are who have a mental illness, who require immediate specialist care, and anything we say will make it worse, and we need to keep away. Jonathan may correct me here, but I think that's not always a helpful or indeed an accurate division. In physical health, there are all of us on some occasion will need immediate physical help and will need to see a doctor or a hospital. But most of being healthy is small everyday things. And most of us will have some physical health complaints, even if we're generally fairly healthy. In the same way in church, none of us will be 100% emotionally and psychologically and spiritually healthy. We will all have needs and wounds and struggles, and we'll all need one another. And so we mustn't be scared and think that there's nothing we can do for those who have a clear and visible problem. But we also mustn't think that those who don't show a visible problem don't need anything. Actually, we all need something.
Yes, I think you're right. The vast majority of people will go through their lives never needing to see someone like me. On the other hand, about 1 in 4 people will have a mental illness. But you're absolutely right. people who do and don't have mental illnesses all have ups and downs in life that can leave them feeling very low and broken, and where the support of the church can be really helpful.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, I'm conscious that time has flown by, as it tends to do in these conversations, and I promised not to make them too long. So I think I'll postpone the large list of additional controversial questions I have waiting for you, and perhaps we can talk about them at another time. But thank you very much for joining us and for offering us your wisdom and your experience. It's been great to hear from you. And we wish you all the best in your ministry.
Thank you. Lovely to see you.
And thank you to all of you who have called in. God bless.